Welcome, everybody. I'm Eve Samples. I'm Executive Director of Friends of the Everglades, which was founded in 1969 by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Welcome to our Clean Water Conversation for February. We have a really important topic here today and some really well-educated guests to enlighten us on it. We're going to be talking about proposed oil drilling in Big Cypress National Preserve and the impacts it could have on not just on our ecosystems, but our cultural resources as well and indigenous communities. So excited to introduce our guests today. Before I do that, just a little bit of background about our Clean Water Conversations. We launched these last year as a method for making it easier for the public, for citizens to stay engaged on critical Everglades issues, even amid COVID-19. And we got so much positive feedback and interaction from you all watching that we decided to keep them going into 2021. This is our second one this year, and we intend to continue that throughout the year. So thank you all for watching. As a reminder, you can submit questions or comments in Facebook in the comments, as well as on YouTube. So those will automatically come our way, and we'll choose the best of them and try to get to as many as we can at the end of our discussion. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guests today. We have three, as you can see on the screen here. The first is Allison Kelly. She's a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council who works to protect communities and wild places from the impacts of fossil fuel development. Prior to joining NRDC, Allison was a regulatory enforcement attorney with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the South Florida Water Management District. I heard Allison speak on this topic we're discussing today just a few weeks ago and was so moved by her presentation that I really wanted to bring it to our audience as well and a broader audience. So thank you for being here, Allison. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Houston Cyprus. He's a two-spirit poet, artist, and activist from the Otter Clan of the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. He resides in the Miccosukee Reservation in the River of Grass region of the Greater Everglades, an area called by his community Kahayatle. Did I pronounce that right, Houston?
Excellent, thank you.
And that can be translated, I just want to say, as shimmering water, which is beautiful. Houston's committed to supporting his Society of Clans by assisting in cultural preservation, environmental protection, community outreach, business development, media and event production, and strengthening sovereignty. That's a lot of duties, and a lot of them tie in with our purpose here today. So welcome, Houston. And last but not least, we have Jackie Lopez. Jackie is a Florida director and a senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity. She coordinates campaigns in the Southeast and Caribbean, focusing on protecting imperiled species and ecosystems. She's presented, written, and taught courses on environmental law and policy issues, and has a wealth of information on a variety of topics affecting the Everglades, and excited to hear from her today. So welcome, Jackie. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, without further ado, Allison's going to kick it off with a presentation about what's going on in Big Cypress. You may have seen the headlines. There's a really concerning proposal from a Texas-based oil company, Burnett Oil, to do potential oil drilling in the Everglades. And Allison is going to walk us through that. We're going to take some time. It's a little different format than most of our conversations. We're going to take some time to just listen to her because she has such great information and visuals on this. And then we'll turn to the conversation portion of this and kind of dig into some Q&A. So Allison, if you're ready to cue it up, you can go right ahead.
I am sharing my screen now. Can you see it?
Very clearly. Thank you.
Great. We'll dive right in. When you think Everglades, you don't normally think oil, you think nature. But there is oil in Florida. Florida has two oil producing regions, one on the western end of the Panhandle bordering Alabama, and another in South Florida in and around Big Cypress National Preserve. The Panhandle accounts for about 3/4 of the state's modest oil output and more than 99% of its gas production. The 5 currently active oil fields in South Florida are in the Sunnyland Trend, and they produce the remaining 1/4 of the state's oil. It's only about 1,300 barrels per day that the state produces, and about 700 come out of Raccoon Point and Bear Island, which are the 2 current legacy oil fields in Big Cypress. As you can see, crude oil production has declined since its peak in 1978. Florida is now ranked 24 out of 50 oil producing states at around 3,000 barrels per day. Compare that to Texas, which is number 1 in production, and it produces 4.6 million barrels per day. So today, Florida has less than 0.1% of the nation's crude oil reserves. Oil production share of the state's GDP is less than 0.2%, which is basically invisible compared to the tourism-based economy we have here in Florida. Nonetheless, oil companies continue to file oil and gas permits with Florida DEP. This is a current list from DEP's Oculus website, which the public can access. The first permit application there was for Burnett Oil Company's seismic testing in Big Cypress Preserve, which took place in 2018, and that's what we're going to talk about momentarily. And what's at stake in Big Cypress? Well, we know that, right? Anyone that's visited Big Cypress understands the important resource areas there, the namesake trees, the marshes, the wildlife habitat. This is primary habitat for the Florida panther, fresh water supply. The preserve provides about 40% of fresh water to Everglades National Park and recharges at least 3 aquifers beneath the preserve, including the Biscayne. Cultural resources and traditional and customary uses, which Houston will talk about, very important. And I can tell you that in about, I think it was 2016, there were over 1 million visitors to Big Cypress. But since the oil exploration began, tourism has declined by 1/6. So here's a map showing where approximately Big Cypress is. The yellow shows where the seismic survey took place. So originally Burnett Oil Company, which is from Texas, proposed 4 phases of oil exploration, which when said and done will encompass 230,000 acres or 1/3 of the preserve, which is larger than most parks, national parks like Biscayne, Shenandoah, and Zion. But it started with phase 1 in 2017. That's about 70,000 acres. Here you can see the same phased outline that I just showed in the Florida Panther primary zone, which is essential for the Florida Panther survival. And Jackie will talk to us a little more about that. The squiggly horizontal lines show approximately where Burnett Oil ran its Vibra-sized trucks, which are 33 tons, through wetlands off-road, looking for oil. The purple vertical line is the Florida National Scenic Trail. This just, goes through I-75 at the top there. So this was all very visible from the preserve when it was happening. This is the 33-ton Vibra-sized truck. Several of them drove off-road through the preserve. They applied the vibrator plate at the bottom to map the geology beneath the surface. And this video was obtained from the National Park Service. It is a camera mounted on the Vibra-sized truck itself. And you can see it driving off-road through wetlands in the preserve. And then the next slide similarly shows driving over cypress trees. Dwarf cypress, as we all know, can be anywhere from 31 to 2,500 years of age, despite their small size. And this shot was taken from the rear of the Vibra-sized truck, showing the soil rutting and damage that was left behind. 2 feet in places. Survey crews were supposed to walk on foot in these conditions with rakes and shovels and push the dirt back into the tire tracks, which did not happen concurrently with survey activities as their permits required. And as you can see, left extensive rutting throughout the preserve. And this is a sampling of photos we also obtained from the National Park Service, showing some of the damage that occurred. You can see in the top left corner, the Vibra-sized truck next to a supporting vehicle. They weren't supposed to be using treaded tires in the preserve to minimize soil impacts. And as you can see, they were destroying cypress trees, either by running them over, as you saw, intentionally cutting them or nicking them as they drove by. Those trucks are a couple feet wide. On the top right-hand corner, you can see them operating with the treaded tires in wet season conditions, which was prohibited by their federal and state permits. You can see them trying to mop up some kind of hydraulic or other fluid there in the water. I like the picture on the left center. A National Park Service employee put their hat in the seismic line so you could see just how deep it was. So that was good to see. Next slide here. And as you can see, there are lasting impacts. The soils have now been exposed to sunlight, creating almost de facto roads in areas that were previously undisturbed. You can see they've tried to reclaim the area. And when I say that, I don't mean replanting. I mean, they're just pushing the dirt back with rakes and shovels into those lines. But you can see on the right, even in wet season conditions, you can tell they haven't gotten the topography correct. It's not the same as it was compared to adjacent undisturbed wetlands. And again, those are the vibra-sized trucks in the preserve using the treaded tires they weren't supposed to use. And so why does this all matter? Well, Burnett Oil Company has now applied to drill for more oil in Big Cypress National Preserve, even though we feel that they are not in compliance with their permits and haven't completed all of the mitigation requirements to compensate for wetland damage that they were supposed to. And actually, the bottom right corner is a shot taken by Lighthawk. It actually does show an old oil pad and road in Big Cypress, just so you can see the amount of filling that will need to take place to, put together all of this infrastructure. And so the oil company, and Jackie will talk to you a little bit more about those applications themselves, but you can see here is a schematic from the NRDC's Fracking 101 webpage that shows just exactly what we're talking about here. Burnett Oil, we don't have all the drilling plans yet, but they have indicated they plan to do some horizontal drilling. As you can see, once they drill vertically from the well pad, they can go thousands of feet, if not a mile, horizontally and crack that limestone that's underneath the preserve. They're going to probably, we haven't seen it yet, but use well stimulation techniques like fracking or acidizing, which would involve shooting hydrochloric acid down the well at high pressure to dissolve the lime rock to help push up the oil. Obviously, as you can see, there's wastewater that comes up with those, with that drilling. Whatever goes down is going to come back up. You also have radioactive materials that occur naturally that will come up. They'll have to do something with that wastewater. They'll either store it above ground in pits, as you see here, or they're going to shoot it back down into some sort of disposal well. They'll also need to get the oil off site somehow, either by trucking it off or building a pipeline to get it out, to get it to the port. So as you can see, there are a lot of impacts that occur once drilling takes place, even horizontal drilling. In addition to all the infrastructure you have to put in nature, the pads and the access roads, you're going to have impacts from emissions, wastewater, and the like. Nearby, communities and reservation, one of which Houston can talk about, is literally adjacent to one of these proposed oil sites. These are roughly where they are. Jackie's going to show you a more detailed map that shows you where the proposed drilling is. One is up near I-75 in a brand new area of the preserve, and the other is on the east side near an existing oil facility. And with that, we're going to turn to Jackie. Houston.
Allison, that was great, Allison. Thank you so much. And as a reminder to our audience, if you have questions about this information and this proposal, please pop them into the comments and we will address them after we get through some of our initial round of Q&A. So Jackie, I do want to turn to you now. Can you give us an update on where these latest permits stand today? They were filed right after what's known as the 404 Wetland Permitting Authority was transferred to the state of Florida. How do these two things tie in as you see it, and where are we headed?
Sure thing. So the background on the 404 assumption is that in 2018, Governor DeSantis signed into law the ability of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to step into the shoes of the Army Corps of Engineers and authorize the dredging and filling of waters of the U.S., which in this case includes Big Cypress and the wetlands therein. And about a year later, DEP submitted its application into the Environmental Protection Agency, which has the authority to approve this type of thing. And in December of 2020, EPA published its approval of Florida assuming this role. And about a month later, Burnett got its applications into the DEP. So this is the first big test case for Florida to show whether it is able to protect waters of the U.S. and in a unit of the National Park System, no less. I think we have a slide that shows Big Cypress and where these well locations are. So this is one of the iconic brochure images that you can get from the National Park Service. This is of Big Cyprus. And here we've gone ahead and added some new features. We've added the Nobles Grade well pad and road in the north there, right next to a recreation access area and a rest stop, right adjacent to the Florida Scenic Trail. And then the other one is the Tamiami Road and well pad, which, as Allison mentioned, is quite close to the Miccosukee Federal Reservation. It's about 0.3 miles away. So next slide, please. The details of what we know of the details of these permits, and part of the complication with Florida assuming the role of authorizing these permits is, first of all, the information was quite difficult to get a hold of. We only sort of incidentally discovered that these applications had been submitted. Ordinarily, when an application is submitted to the Army Corps, there's a public notice made available, and it's a system that we're able to track in a more transparent way. But nonetheless, we did discover them, and from the paperwork we found available online, we discovered some details about this Nobles Grade road and well pad. It would require constructing a new 3.7 mile long road, about 15 feet wide. So the acreage there is about 15 acres, and it would terminate at a well pad, which makes it sound really small, like you think of a little pad, but this is actually a massive construction and development site, about 5 acres large, where the wells would be bored and operating. And the Seminole tribe has identified this project within the area of interest, and that there are a great number of cultural resources that are in the area that they are concerned about. Down in the southeast corner, we have the Tamiami Road and well pad. So this is a road, a new road that would be constructed off of the legacy drilling that Allison mentioned. And it would be about 1.5 miles long, about still 15 feet wide, and cover about 6 acres if you calculate that there, and terminate in another well pad almost 5 acres large as well. And in addition to getting about 1 million visitors a year, at least before the seismic exploration began, we expect that to return. It also represents the largest contiguous habitat for Florida panther. But another really important thing to consider is it has the largest fire management regime of any national park system unit. It's a massive park system or a unit, and it burns about 60,000 acres a year, and it has to be in a highly coordinated way. I think I have one more slide here to show, again, some of the species impacts. So all those little dots, and in some areas it just looks like a cluster of red, that's the telemetry data of Florida panthers. And you can see panthers heavily use Big Cypress. It is in the center, as Allison showed earlier, of their primary habitat. And but that's not all. It's also habitat, actually federally designated critical habitat for the Everglades snailkite. And it's currently proposed, we're waiting on a final decision from the Fish and Wildlife Service to designate final habitat for the Florida bonneted bat. There's also an additional 43 other endangered and threatened species in the preserve area or within 1 mile of the boundaries of these projects. So all of those things are the things that Florida, now stepping into the shoes of the federal government, will have to consider in whether it's going to approve these permits.
Thanks, Jackie. So as we can see from what you just said, Big Cypress is not just ecologically vital. It plays a lot of other roles for Florida. It also plays a really important role in terms of moving more clean water south to Everglades National Park, and potentially could play a greater role. And that's something we talk an awful lot about in Everglades restoration circles. Before we turn to Houston, I have one more question for you, Jackie. So, of course, we hope these permits don't get approved, and Friends of the Everglades has joined the chorus in that regard. Thank you for the leadership of NRDC and the Center for Biological Diversity on that front. But if they do, how quickly could this happen? When might construction start? When might drilling start? And how long would it go on for?
Well, originally, the applicants had wanted to spud the first well by next June. But we have seen a request for additional information come in from the DEP to the applicant, giving it until May to complete its paperwork. So it's unclear how soon it could start. I mean, I imagine that site preparation would start as soon as they have the permits for access. The one thing I didn't mention is we are aware of, but have not seen directly, an application put into the National Park Service itself. So that's a authorization to do operations within the preserve. And that has not been made publicly available, but was referenced in other documents that we stumbled across. In terms of its longevity, the application says that it would be in operation for 30 years.
Okay, so this decision will have really long-term impacts, physically, visibly, and then of course, fossil fuel impacts could go well beyond that. So thank you for that information. We're going to talk more about how folks who are interested can get involved in stopping this bad proposal from moving forward. But I think it's really important first to turn to Houston to talk about impacts on the Miccosukee tribe. So the enabling legislation of Big Cypress National Preserve codified the rights of indigenous sovereignties. So after these permits were filed, I know some representatives of the tribe said they were deeply concerned about the impacts. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see impacts on the people and cultural and archaeological sites in the area?
Cool, thank you. So just recently, the Miccosukee tribe has undergone their annual review. It's actually done every 3 years with regards to the water quality standards that the tribe has in place on the federal reservation areas. There's a couple of them in the region. And so here we have the Miccosukee tribe doing their best to implement policies that are restorative of these places. And yet we have projects like these that put all of that into jeopardy. And so I wanted to talk a little bit by showing you some pictures of, all right, cool, you got it? Thank you. So what we're looking at is a conference back in 1936 between Seminole Indians like Josie Billy and Corey Osceola and others meeting up with the Florida governor. And Florida basically asked the Seminole Indians at the time what they could do to help the Seminole and indigenous communities there. And they pretty much basically said, leave us alone. We'll go to the next slide. But today we don't have that luxury anymore of being isolated. In fact, the indigenous communities are trying in many ways to be good citizens. We're doing this because we want to protect our way of life because of the ongoing colonization. We want to continue speaking our languages and also to restore an environment that's so often degraded by the runoff and the demands of modern living. So when we look at the enabling legislation, the kind of rights that are codified in there include hunting, gardening, using the plants for shelter as well as for medicinal uses. And the proximity of the application site to the federal reservation is deeply alarming because not only are we trying very hard to restore the Everglades, but there are very important cultural sites and very sacred archaeological sites in the area that are going to be threatened by this application permit. And basically this creation of an industrial site in the middle of the Big Cypress National Preserve. We really got to do what we can to look at the consequences of Florida taking over the 404 permitting. We'll go ahead to the next slide. Because so much of the consequences of that action, it diminishes the Indian country that the Miccosukee people and the Seminole people are concerned about. Here we have Miccosukees trying to really determine what areas they have authority over, meaning what areas that they can care for properly. And since then, the talks have resumed, but it was something that was very concerning to us. We're also looking at the damages to sovereignty because what were federal level discussions have been relegated to the state. And it's concerning because the state of Florida doesn't have a legal obligation to consult with the tribes like the federal government does. But there is actually a Florida Governor's Council on Indian Affairs in Florida. So let's push to strengthen that forum. And again, we're really concerned that Florida is not going to be able to give the stringent protections that federal agencies provide. Because if you look at the past of Everglades restoration projects, there's been instances where a special master has been appointed to oversee certain restoration projects because Florida couldn't live up to its promises. Let's go to the next slide. But overall in the bigger picture, let's do what we can to come together. I'm constantly reminding folks that back in 2009, the U.S. actually apologized to Native peoples. And so what this means is that we are in a context of reconciliation. Let's live up to the promises of the past, and let's live up to the principles that are enshrined in that U.S. apology. We'll go to the next slide. And the Miccosukee tribe and the Seminole tribe are doing great scientific work. I just mentioned the water quality standards that the Miccosukee tribe updated. The Seminoles are doing great work in protecting the waters of the state too, especially through their litigation. So let's do what we can to expand the scope of the sciences that the tribes are conducting, and let's fund that scientific work. And let's go on to the final slide. And again, let's make sure that the consultation process is meaningful, not just a checkbox, not just a letter, not just a phone call. Let's actually meet face to face. Let's have long, deep, meaningful conversations and do what we can to integrate Indigenous priorities into our policies. Because when it comes to the environment, Indigenous rights are everyone's rights. We want a healthy, thriving environment, and you deserve it too. Thank you.
Thank you, Houston. I want to circle back to something you just said about meaningful consultation. And I think that's been sorely lacking in many regards, particularly in terms of Indigenous rights. How can folks listening to us right now apply pressure to their elected leaders to engage in more meaningful consultation, do you think?
Well, there's definitely the levels of the state government and the levels of the federal government that you can engage. And I also pointed out the Florida Governor's Council on Indian Affairs that we can strengthen. So definitely call, definitely write, definitely email. Those kind of communications are tracked and counted. And the more you do that, the more it shows up on the radar of our elected officials. Also, let's make sure that these stories show up in the public. If you have contacts with the media, place them in the media. Educate yourselves by word of mouth. And get to know these places by visiting them, and support the direct actions that the Indigenous communities are leading by people like Betty Osceola and others in the community. So these are just some ways that you can help. And of course, let's not forget the spiritual perspective. Integrate these actions and concerns into your prayers and ceremonies as well.
Thank you for that. I have to ask you, Houston, how you're regarding, and if you're hopeful about the nomination of the first Native American person to lead Department of Interior, Deb Haaland. What are your initial thoughts on whether we might see more meaningful consultation as the result of that?
You know, of course, I'm going to be hopeful, and of course, I'm going to be supportive of the work that Ms. Haaland will be able to conduct in her office. But I'm also realistic in the fact that we have significant opposition by other parties in the process. So again, that encourages us as the people that they represent to make sure that they live up to what we're hiring them for. These people are working for you, for us, and let's make sure we hold our elected officials accountable and support the efforts that Haaland and others are going to be able to do in that office.
Wonderful. So I want to turn back now to the ecological impacts. So as Houston just said, visit these places, right? Big Cyprus is a stunningly beautiful place. And a couple of us from Friends of the Everglades went on a swamp walk there back in December and saw dwarf cypress trees that we sadly saw mowed down in the videos Allison showed. So Allison, I want to ask you a little bit more about this directional drilling from a single well pad. So underneath the surface, what we might not see if these plans move forward, how does that present special concerns for the Everglades, that kind of directional drilling?
Well, again, you know, we all know what our water table is like here in Florida. And there are, like I said, at least 3 aquifers located beneath the preserve, one of which is a sole source aquifer designated by the EPA, the Biscayne, which means at least 50% of drinking water and also agricultural water supplies comes from that aquifer. So anytime you have a spill or a leak of these chemicals involved with oil and gas operations, there is cause for concern. And there's no way to 100% prevent oil spills and leaks. Also, like I said, all the fluids that they will shoot down the well, if they're doing well stimulation techniques like fracking or acidizing, that will come back up and it will need to be dealt with. Again, also, I want to point out too that the oil companies don't have to report all of the chemicals that they use in fracking or acidizing fluids. We've seen in the places in the interior West that makes it very difficult for communities to understand their public health risks. So in addition to the environmental impacts, you could have potential for public health impacts as well if there's a spill or leak. Also, if they're pipelining the oil out or trucking it out, you could have another point of an accident there. Also, air emissions, we're very concerned due to the proximity of the reservation, what the impacts of that could be. And also to our climate, right? We have greenhouse gas emissions coming off of oil and gas wells and pipelines and related infrastructure. And, you know, we are very concerned about the damage is going to be to our climate. And as everyone knows here in Florida, we're at the front line of impacts from climate change, like sea level rise.
Right. And I do want to turn back to climate change in the context of the change in administration in Washington, D.C. But before we do that, a question for either you or Jackie, and Houston, feel free to jump in. So let's just acknowledge that there has been some lower volume oil exploration in Big Cypress in the past, right? But this was done before the preserve was created. So let's talk about why it's different now and what kind of precedent this would be setting.
Yeah, so there is legacy conventional oil development in Big Cypress, and that means not horizontal drilling or well stimulation activities that we're aware of. We do have a few outstanding FOIA requests with the National Park Service that have not yet been fulfilled, but we're trying to get that information so we can share it with you all and the rest of the public. But there has been exploration, I think as recently as 1999 at Raccoon Point. However, it was much smaller in scale. The scale of what is contemplated today and what has been put in motion, as I mentioned, is larger than several national parks. This is unprecedented in Florida. This has never been done, and we're going to have an experiment of this magnitude in the middle of the Everglades, which we're trying to restore. We're spending billions of dollars on. So obviously, this is not the right place for this type of activity, period.
That puts it very well. Anything to add, Jackie or Houston, on that front, why this is different than what we've seen in the past? Okay, we have plenty more questions, so we'll move on from there. This one, I believe is for you, Jackie. So last year, after Burnett plowed through parts of Big Cypress as part of its exploration, and again, those videos are just so striking and disturbing. After that happened, the Army Corps of Engineers said that Burnett had violated the Clean Water Act through its seismic testing and damaged sensitive areas. But I think it was just a month later that the Army Corps backed off and reversed itself. So what's the deal there? What happened? Why the change?
Yeah, and this is deserving of additional background information. So when the National Park Service authorized the permits to conduct seismic exploration in the preserve, NRDC Allison's organization, the Center for Biological Diversity, my organization, Conservancy of Southwest Florida, and National Park Conservation Association, I might be leaving out another group, but we litigated that decision and lost. And we lost on all of our claims. We said, you didn't do enough analysis. We don't think your mitigation is going to work. We think there's going to be damage that you haven't accounted for. And when we lost, we didn't just walk away and abandon the issue. We reinvested in the preserve and hired qualified biologists, ecologists, people who can document the damage. And we did that for several years. We documented the damage, we documented the attempted reclamation and recovery efforts, we mapped it, we put together reports, and we sent it to the Park Service, and we sent it to the DEP, and we sent it to whoever we thought would listen, and we were ignored. Until one day, we finally got the ear of the right person at the right time, and it was an agent working for the Corps, and we said, look what has happened in the preserve. This very clearly is an impact to wetlands that should be regulated under Section 404, that authority that has now been kicked over to the state, but at that time was with the Army Corps. And we got him out in the field. And he said, oh, wow, you're right. This is clear, it's evident, it's ubiquitous throughout this area. It's a massive area in the preserve where this damage was done. And he issued with not just unilaterally, he issued with his staff a memorandum detailing why this is a type of activity that needs to be regulated under the 404 permitting, which is how you get a permit to either dredge or fill a wetland, and had it signed off. And he sent it off to Burnett and said, if you do this activity in the future, you need to come to us for this type of permit, because they didn't in the past. In fact, the Corps had said, you don't need one. We don't think based on what you're telling us, you'll need one. So that happened. And without explanation, apparent explanation, because we've asked for it, we have FOIA'd for it, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, which is when any person can ask the government for all the documents they use to make their decision making. We've done that. There's nothing in there that shows us why 1 month later, in a 2-paragraph, single-page letter to Burnett, it said, mea culpa, we're sorry. What you did was totally cool by us. Carry on. And then that was it.
It's really disturbing, and I think illustrates the forces that we're up against often in terms of ecological preservation. We are outgunned, and the special interests have connections inside that we don't always have. So thank you for your work on that, and thank you for explaining that. I think it creates a greater level of urgency in terms of what we're facing right now. So let's talk about this transparency, or maybe it's lack thereof. First of all, the video footage you got was incredible. I presume that was from a public records request. So remarkable to see it, because seeing it really tells the story of the damage, at least in terms of the exploration and seismic testing. But as both of you alluded, Allison and Jackie, you found these permit applications, the most recent round, almost by accident. So tell us a little bit more about the public records request concerns here. What more should the state of Florida be doing to communicate with us now that they've assumed this 404 permitting authority? Something's missing here. So how can we fix it?
Well, I think just, I work in DC now, even though I'm in Florida right now. I'm from Florida. But someone that we work with on the ground from the Conservancy of Southwest Florida found them randomly searching on this brand new State 404 website. Folks like me, that old timers from DEP, I would just look on the Oculus website that I showed you that list of permits on. I had no idea this new website existed for State 404 permits, and they were being kept separately from other permits like environmental resource permits, which this will also need, and geophysical oil and gas permits, which this will need as well. So I think for members of the public, it's very difficult with all these different agencies have their processes and they have all different websites. Back in the day, you'd publish in the newspaper when something was going on so everyone could see it. Now, not everyone has broadband access either. And we're in a pandemic. People are struggling with other more important things. And here we are trying to piece together all of these bits and pieces. In addition, the National Park Service has their own website. It's called PEPC or PEPC, where folks can go online and look at open comment periods. We understand that the oil company has submitted application materials to them for their operations permit, but they won't give them to us. We're going to have to do another FOIA, which, again, why are we having to go through all this time and effort as members of the public to get information about our public lands? And I also want to flag for folks following water use. These type of operations require a lot of water. And so they're going to have to apply to the South Florida Water Management District in addition for water use permits. So that's yet another permit piece to keep in mind and to track down. I've actually had to sign up for public alerts for all water use permits in Collier County, just so I can keep track of when they submit their application.
Yeah, it's practically a full-time job just tracking all the permit applications and figuring out where they come in. Houston, how did the Miccosukee tribe become aware of this? Oh, and I think you need to unmute, Houston.
Cool, thank you. In terms of the 404 issue, it kind of came to the attention of the tribe at the last minute because the tribe was in ongoing negotiations with the EPA regarding the area that they have authority over, which was what I was talking about earlier, a diminishment of Indian country. And so as the tribe was having this discussion on one side, the EPA was already working with Florida, advising Florida of the process of how to work in the 404 context. So they represented to the tribe one thing while getting ready for the rollout with Florida on the other side. And so it wasn't until I think maybe even like a couple of days before that the tribe was notified that this assumption of the 404 permitting was going to happen. So it was something that we heard at the last minute and something that really upset the community on many levels, not only legally, but morally and spiritually as well. And since then, the discussions have resumed, but it was something that was sprung upon the tribe.
Thank you for explaining that. That it really does feel like an affront, especially when you're blindsided by such a dramatic proposal. So in that vein, about a week ago, Friends of the Everglades joined NRDC and Center for Biological Diversity, and as well as the Miccosukee Tribe's opposition to this. And we asked Friends of the Everglades followers to email Governor DeSantis and DEP asking them to reject these permits, these latest round of permits. And so far, last I checked, more than 450 supporters had done so, totaling more than 900 messages. And that number is probably higher now. And for those of you watching who are interested, we'll be sure to send you a link to send that pre-formatted letter so that you can chime in if you'd like to. But I have a question in that regard. Other than sending letters, which can help, what else can Floridians do to help increase the chances that Burnett's proposal is not followed through upon? So I'll start with you, Jackie, and I'd like to go around the horn on this one. Just your best advice on how to stop this.
Sure thing. And one thing I forgot to mention is we are challenging that 404 assumption. So that's in federal court right now. So we're not just going to let that stand. I mean, I'm a big fan of contacting the person who your community elected to represent you and telling them how you feel about this and having them apply pressure as a lawmaker. They have tools at their disposal to shut stuff like this down. And we should be letting them know that that's what, as they represent us in these offices, like Houston said, in federal and state office. And even don't underestimate what your municipality can do to be on the phone, be in their ear constantly. That's their job, is to listen to you.
Exactly. And Jackie, I just want to follow up on that point directly, because there was a bill filed in January, both in the Florida House and the Florida Senate, that would prohibit DEP from granting permits for drilling of wells for oil and gas structures in the Everglades protection area. That's a very clearly defined area that does not include Big Cypress. So if we were able to convince our lawmakers to amend that bill to include Big Cypress, do you think that would resolve this issue largely? Jackie?
I think that is a really common sense measure that should be taken to address it. And I think that the majority of Floridians would be behind it.
Great. And Friends of the Everglades will send follow-up information about that pending bill and how we can all chime in to advocate for amending it to include Big Cypress. Thank you for that. So Houston, what do you think? What can everyday people do who are interested to stop this?
Well, I'm a fan of nonviolent direct action, meaning let's make a colorful ruckus. Let's be creative in how we advocate for this position that we're standing up for. But aside from that, let's work with the press and the media to do some more public storytelling. And I want to pass the ball along to Allison to tell us more about the legal challenge that we can do using the process of the law. And I know that Allison's very informed on that, so I'll let her explain a little bit more too.
Go for it, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there are several points of entry. As Jackie mentioned, CBD and other organizations are challenging the state 404 assumption as a whole, which is super important to make sure that Florida's handling these types of permits correctly. Also, the National Park Service will have a NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act, public comment period. It has not been posted yet on that PEPC website that I mentioned. But once it is, it'll be a very short comment period, like 30 days. Of course, we always ask for more time so we can get in our consultants, our environmental consultant reports, and other meaningful comment. Technical science-based comment takes time to get it before those agencies for their consideration. Also, proper government-to-government consultation has to take place. It cannot be this check-the-box function that always sent, like Houston said, we sent a letter or an email. They are going to have to wait, and we have made this argument throughout the country. They need to wait till the pandemic crisis is over so they can have meaningful face-to-face consultation. End of story. That needs to happen. And if those things don't happen, there are legal remedies that we pursued on the seismic under the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, and also the National Historic Preservation Act for cultural and archaeological resources. We want to make sure those are protected as well. In addition to contacting your state legislative folks, which you absolutely should, the governor, as you're doing with the Action Alert Friends put out, also your U.S. senators and representatives are important as well. One of our senators, Marco Rubio, has come out against offshore drilling. There's no reason why onshore drilling should not be part of that agenda, since all of the water is connected, as we all know. You have a spill in the Everglades, you're going to have a spill offshore. So in the bay, wherever it is, I mean, it's all connected. So we need to make sure that that's protected as well. Also, please reach out to the Big Cypress Preserve Superintendent, Tom Forsyth, the Everglades Superintendent, Pedro Ramos. Please feel free to reach out to those folks. Ask for public meetings, virtual or however they can be done right now on these issues. That's also important. And there's also a statewide fracking ban on the state legislative agenda again this year. There have been for the past few years, unfortunately, haven't passed. But we need to make sure we get a statewide fracking ban that includes the acidizing that I talked about, to make sure if they're going to do the drilling at the end of the day, they're not using these well stimulation techniques that could harm our water and communities.
Thank you for the legal legwork on this. I know it's a very heavy lift, and at Friends of the Everglades, we want to make it easy for Floridians to weigh in with the right people. So we'll follow up on some of those angles you just mentioned, Allison, to make sure we're contacting all the folks that could influence this for a positive outcome. We're getting a bunch of questions coming in, and we're going to get to those. I'm just going to answer one easy one quickly. Someone asked for the bill number regarding banning drilling of wells and gas structures in the Everglades protection area. It's House Bill 333 and Senate Bill 722. So feel free to look those up, and we'll also follow up. So one last question for me, then we're going to turn it to audience questions for the remainder of our time. And my question relates to the broader context of climate change and national energy policy. So we had a change in administration in Washington, D.C. in January. And the same month, the Biden administration announced a moratorium on offering public lands and waters for oil and gas development. So does that offer any protection in this case? And does the federal government, or the administration, I should say, have recourse to stop this on its own?
So I'll take this one if that's okay. I should have mentioned that this is called a split estate situation in Big Cypress National Preserve. That's why part of the reason it's a preserve and not a park under the national park system. So the federal government owns the surface, and many entities, including the Collier family, as in Collier County, Florida, own the minerals beneath. That would be the oil and gas. And so the Collier family entities have leased their mineral rights to this Texas-based oil company. And so the federal government still has the ability and the obligation to regulate the surface of the preserve for future generations, and for the reasons that the preserve was established in the first place, for all those resources that we went over. And so we need to make sure that they're doing that effectively. There's a 10% area of limitation for oil and gas in the preserve. They need to be mindful of that. We have not seen that calculation with the new seismic and the proposed drilling. They need to do that and release it to the public. And also the EO talks about tackling climate change and acknowledges fossil fuel development plays a role in climate change. And so while there is no federal lease situation in this case, because the private minerals are owned by a private entity, there is a pause on new federal leasing taking place at the federal level. And I have a feeling that when they're reviewing all the climate impacts associated with the oil and gas leasing program, they're going to see similar problems with permitting. And maybe not in all cases for valid existing leases, but in this case, I think they're going to take a look and see that industrializing the Everglades for the next 30 plus years is not consistent with their climate goals.
That's very helpful. Anything to add, Jackie or Houston?
Maybe just that, and I think Allison really hit all the high notes. The purposes of the preserve are to maintain and conserve the biological, ecological, cultural features of the area. One of the possible uses that are explicitly acknowledged are development of mineral rights. But the enabling legislation also says that if there are uses that are threatened, that are detrimental to the purposes of the preserve, and again, the purpose of the preserve is not to enable oil and gas development, it is to preserve the conditions of the preserve, then those activities don't need to be authorized. So that's explicit, that's already law, and we think that the law should be followed here.
So we'll go ahead and take some audience questions. Allie is our behind the scenes director here. We always appreciate her efforts during our clean water conversation. So Allie, if you see any questions you'd like to pop into the screen here, please go ahead with that. And while we're waiting for that, Houston, one question for you. We're talking a lot in general terms about cultural and archaeological resources. What does that look like on the ground? Can you tell us a little bit about what we would find in the Miccosukee tribal lands that we need to protect?
All right, when it comes to cultural and archaeological sites of importance, with the kinds of places that I'm specifically referring to are places that historical events have occurred. Maybe these are battle sites of conflicts between the indigenous people and the United States. More significantly, these could also be places where ceremonies are being conducted today, whether these are New Year's ceremonies or other rites of passage. These are places where spiritual beliefs are expressed and maintained on the ground. And something that's a little bit more serious for us, which we have a lot of respect in talking about, are places where we lay our loved ones to rest. I'm talking about burial sites. And so these are places that are very sacred that we try to avoid specifying so that they are not desecrated. So these are the kinds of places that I'm talking about. Battle sites, ceremonial sites, burial sites, and just the overall vibrant, thriving landscape that we want, which we continue to engage with through our hunting, through our gardening, through our plant medicine collections and things like that.
Thank you for illustrating that a bit for us. So here is a question from the audience from Rhonda Roth. Thank you, Rhonda. The Big Cypress Preserve is federally managed. The tribes are sovereign nations which have a government-to-government relationship with the federal government. How does that square with the state of Florida managing Section 404? We touched on this a little bit, but let's expand on it a little bit more, and I'll open it up to the group in terms of an answer.
Sure. I would like to start off the conversation by saying that the federal government has a trust responsibility with regards to the Indian sovereignties, the indigenous sovereignties. And that trust responsibility can be expressed in many ways, but suffice it to say that there are promises that must be upheld. Some of these promises include maintaining the environment in a natural state. But when it comes to Florida's relationship with the state, with the indigenous tribes, there is no federal obligation in place. There is no law that says that they must consult meaningfully. But even though that there is no law in place, that doesn't stop them from contacting the tribes and having, for example, the Florida Governor's Council on Indian Affairs as a forum for discussion. So Florida has no obligation, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't consult, which means that they should consult. So those are some things I'd like to offer to start off the conversation.
Since you, Allison and Jackie, are involved in the legal challenge to the 404 transfer, any thoughts on this particular angle?
I'm not involved in the challenge. Jackie is.
Sorry, Jackie.
Yeah, and because we are, I'm not going to say too much about it, except to say that we don't think that the state can fulfill those federal obligations.
Fair enough. Okay, so do we have any more audience questions, Allie, that you'd like to pop in? If not, I'm going to turn back to some of our questions that I have here. I'll scroll through them. Okay, we have a lot of comments. Thanks for doing this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just a lot of affirmation of the public interest in this. So, you know, with the few minutes that we have left, I want to remind everyone that Friends of the Everglades will be working with our very valuable partners here to stay informed and help notify the public when there's an opportunity to weigh in and who to weigh in with. So keep an eye out on your email inbox for that. I just want to, I think, spend our last few minutes going around the horn again and putting this into context, providing some insights in terms of what's really at stake here, the irreversible damage that could occur ecologically and the precedent that could be set, and what kind of urgency is involved in taking action. So I'll start off with you, Jackie, if you wouldn't mind.
So this is dire. We are on the precipice of a vast expansion of industrialization in the preserve. And once it's done, it can't be undone. And we know that because just looking at the seismic exploration and all of the permit conditions and promises that were made, and to go out there and ground truth it and to see, no kidding, it's not possible to undo 15-foot wide, 2 feet deep rutting over 100 miles in a swamp. The other thing I would say is, if you haven't been out to Big Cypress personally, you absolutely should. Even though it is a vast wilderness area, it is also very accessible. The Florida Scenic Trail, there's primitive camping, and there's epiphytes bromeliads, the dwarf cypress. Last time I was out, I saw evidence of bears in the area, and it's wild Florida. And it's a national treasure, but it's also really special to the folks that live in this area to go out there and use it, and then share that information with their friends. Help people fall in love and protect this place.
Thank you, Jackie. Houston, thoughts from you? I've been so moved by the Defend the Sacred marches and activism we've seen, and you have such a unique perspective as a poet and an activist and a communicator. What do you think we can do right now, and what are your final thoughts on this for our audience?
Well, we understand that to foster stewardship, we should advocate for access and use. And thinking broader, that the compartmentalization of the landscape, the chopping up, the dividing, the canalization and all of that, compartmentalizing has serious consequences on our mental health. So let's go out and reconnect to these places and heal ourselves. And remember that in a broader situation, we're dealing with climate change, which is accelerating so much of the processes that that industrialization is contributing to. So let's dive deep meaningfully into resilience and sustainability and go back and connect to these places and heal ourselves.
I love that. And I think in this pandemic era we're all living in, there's been a natural tug to do that. And we should all probably act on those instincts more often. I know I should. Allison, I'm going to give you the final word. Thank you again for the eye-opening presentation. What do you think we should walk away from today,
Well, I concur. We need to get out to Big Cypress. I hope to get out there soon myself. It's very easily accessible from I-75 mile marker 63 south. If y'all haven't been out that way, I think most people enter at the visitor center at Tamiami Trail. But if you really want to see some of the areas that will be impacted by the oil drilling and have already been impacted by the seismic testing I showed on the video, head down the Florida National Scenic Trail from mile marker 63 south. And if you walk in several miles down and through what I call this Cypress Cathedral or church, you'll stop right at one of the seismic lines. So if folks have information on that, please reach out. Also, I want to end on a positive note. Florida, I think, is fourth in terms of solar potential at this time. The Sunshine State really needs to move away from these archaic fossil fuel development plans when there's minimal oil. It's not great quality oil in the Everglades. We need to put a pin in that and move forward with, the future. And the future is in renewables. And the Sunshine State cannot afford to its fossil fuel habit any longer. So I want to end on a positive note that solar is the way forward, and Florida could lead on this issue. Thank
you, Allison. As a final word for me, I actually want to take some of Houston's words and amplify them. He said we should make a colorful ruckus on this, and that reminds me of John Lewis's Good Trouble, and that also reminds me of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's Be a Nuisance Where It Counts, which we think about every day at Friends of the Everglades. So I hope that the information we provided here today will empower those of you listening to do just that. We're going to keep communicating on this, and we'll be watching closely to see what action our state and federal leaders take as a result of this, especially the state. The decision is really in their hands at this moment, at least, and we will be working to apply public pressure so that they do the right thing. So I can't thank you all enough. I hope we'll keep in touch on this front. Stay well, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Care.